The wind descending from the mountains of Lochaber carried more than just the cold. It carried ancient accusations, cruel silences, and a guilt that was never Agnes MacRae's. In that impoverished village, nestled between grey hills, everyone knew who she was, the young woman marked by her appearance, her origin, and the fact that she lived under the rule of an enemy Laird, the same man who commanded the lands where her family had been left to die. To them, Agnes was not welcome. She was not trustworthy. She belonged nowhere. But what no one imagined was that she would be the very one to change the fate of the most feared man in the Highlands, and of all those who dared to judge her. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay until the end of this story. Because what begins as rejection and pain ends in a way that no one in that village could ever predict. The ground was a carpet of frozen mud and despair. The sky, a low mantle of heavy clouds, tinged. Everything with a grey that seemed to suck the life out of things. The stone and peat houses crouched against the hillside, as if trying to escape the constant wind that whistled through the cracks, bringing the damp smell of moss and burnt wood. Agnes moved through this landscape with the fluidity of a shadow. Her wool dress, in a green so soft it almost blended with the moss on the stones, and a faded grey shawl, were the only colours that did not scream against the scenery. The colours of Clan MacRae, colours of memory and decline. But it wasn't the colours that drew attention. It was her. Her hair was too light, a shade so pale that, under the cold winter light, it seemed almost white. Her skin was excessively fair, as if the sun had never touched it, and those eyes too clear for comfort, an uncertain hue between grey and green, that some said did not belong entirely to this world. There were those who whispered, on nights of strong winds, that no child was born that way without a dark explanation, that perhaps her mother had made an unthinkable pact, or that blood too ancient, mixed with the wrong kind, still ran through the MacRae veins. She crossed the open space that served as the village centre, where some men were unloading a wagon. Her footsteps made no sound in the mud. Her presence likewise caused no ripples in the village's social pond, only the kind of cautious silence reserved for that which is not well understood. A middle-aged man, seeing her approach, abruptly turned his shoulders, as if the mere sight of that light hair could bring bad luck, feigning deep interest in a piece of rope. Two women talking by the well instantly lowered their voices, not into a whisper of secrets, but into a flat, heavy tone laden with ancient judgment, a tone Agnes had known forever. "It's the MacRae," said one, the elder, without moving her lips enough for the sound to seem directed at anyone. "The one with no dowry, nor the colour of common folk. The daughter of the woman who meddled with those herbs," the other added, casting a quick, suspicious glance over her shoulder, like someone fearing being seen observing too much. "They say she learned more than she should have. No one is born with hair the colour of frost without paying a price." Agnes passed them. Her face remained a serene landscape of smooth stone, despite the involuntary flush that the cold always left on her pale cheeks. Not. A muscle twitched. Her eyes, those two clear eyes, were fixed on a distant point, on the line where the mountain met the sky. She had learned as a young girl that every blink in the face of these blows was a granted victory, that every tear held back in public was a river of pain saved to be shed in secret, away from all eyes. Pain was an internal, silent burden, and she carried it with the same discretion with which she carried the handfuls of dried roots and rolled leaves in the folds of her apron. On the other side of the space, a group of children played at chasing a scrawny dog. One of them, a boy of perhaps 7 with a dirty face, stopped when he saw her. His gaze lingered on the light hair, then on the eyes. He pointed with a short finger. "Look, it's the MacRae witch," he shouted, repeating with the careless cruelty of childhood what he had heard said at the table, between one prayer and another. The others laughed, a sharp and brief sound. Agnes did not quicken her pace, nor did she slow it down. She continued, like a boat sailing through waters that could no longer stir it. She did not belong to that place. The village granted her physical space, but no social anchor. She existed on the margin, tolerated by the historical necessity of an impoverished clan still having a face, but not welcomed by it. Meanwhile, in stark contrast to her invisibility, the presence of the other clan made itself known, not through integration, but through the weight of its authority. Beside the meeting house, a structure slightly larger than the others, 3 men stood. They did not mingle. They observed. Their tartans were an explosion of authority in the grey of the day. Deep red like dried blood, dark green like the forest at night, black stripes like morning. Cameron. The air around them seemed colder, denser. They were armed. Short swords at their waists, metal fasteners glinting with a dull sheen under the weak light. One of them, taller and with a red moustache that looked like a flame against his pale skin, was Dougal Cameron. His eyes, small and shrewd, scanned the ground and rested for a moment on the slender and solitary figure of Agnes as she disappeared down an alleyway. "That one," he said to his companions, his voice a low, dry growl. "The MacRae, poor as the stones and as useful as a leaky boat." One of the younger men frowned. "She does no harm to anyone, Dougal." "Harm?" Dougal spat on the ground near the young man's feet. "It's not about doing harm, it's about taking up space. It's about being a reminder that the MacRaes still breathe, when everyone knows they should have learned to lie still after what happened at Quarefour." He paused, letting the name of the pass hang in the air like a threat. "She belongs nowhere. Not here, not there. She is a ghost who hasn't yet learned that she's dead." The sentence, spoken with the coldness of someone announcing the weather forecast, cut through the air and lingered. It was a cruel truth, the kind that isn't discussed, only accepted. And in that village it seemed to be the only truth about Agnes that everyone agreed upon. As Dougal turned his back to enter the meeting house, his final comment was heard by the men at the door, who whispered among themselves, "Kenneth won't tolerate any more provocations from the Frasers. If Alistair thinks he can run patrols near Quarefour Pass, he's going to learn." "Will the Laird be back tomorrow?" someone asked. "He will, and when he's here there will be a decision. This dispute over the pass has lasted a generation. Enough." The name Kenneth was not spoken aloud. It was whispered, as if it were a word either sacred or cursed. The Laird Cameron, the wolf of Lochaber. His reputation was a tangible force, more present than the man himself. It was the fear in the eyes of the men when they looked north, from where he would come. It was the stiffer posture of the sentries. It was the sudden silence that fell over certain subjects. Agnes, already far away, inside the small, dark and damp cottage she shared with Mary, her great-aunt, heard the distant murmur of voices and the silenced name. She placed her gathered herbs on the rough wooden table. Her hands, thin and scarred from work, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the constant tension of existing in a world that saw her but did not perceive her. She looked through the crack in the door toward the mountains in the background, where the snow was already beginning to paint the highest peaks white. Quarefour Pass was there, hidden between 2 peaks, the place that had swallowed her father and her brothers, the place that now once again whispered promises of conflict. The wind howled, battering the door. Somewhere in the mountains, a wolf howled in response, and in the village, the feeling that something imminent and heavy was approaching was as clear and sharp as the cold entering through the cracks. The humiliation of the day was merely a prelude. The true winter of both nature and men was about to arrive. The council was taking place in the great hall of the Cameron main house, a room with low beams of oak darkened by smoke and time. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax, wet wool, and a tension that had its own weight. Men with weathered faces and cautious eyes filled the benches, their tartans, primarily. The deep reds and dark greens of the Camerons, with a few patterns from smaller clans interwoven, forming a mosaic of loyalty and power. At the center, standing before the hearth where thick logs crackled, casting dancing shadows, stood Kenneth. He did not need to occupy space with words. His presence filled the room. Tall, with shoulders that seemed carved to carry the weight of mountains, he wore his tartan with the severity of armor. The deep red in the coarse wool recalled the core of an old wound. The dark green brought to mind the impenetrable forests he commanded, the black, the ruthlessness of his decisions. A broad sword hung from his belt, and the hilt of a dirk protruded from his boot. The weapons were not ornaments. They were extensions of his authority, as much a part of him as the scars that crossed his fingers and the side of his neck, pale against wind-burned skin. His hair, the color of embers under ash, was pulled back, revealing an angular face. No, feature was soft. The jaw was tense, the lips a thin line. His eyes, a grey as cold as the winter sky before snow, scanned the men present, measuring, evaluating, silencing any murmur before it could arise. Alistair Fraser, chief of a neighbouring clan whose loyalty shifted with the wind, was the one speaking. He was a middle-aged man with a well-trimmed beard and a smile that never reached his eyes. "The Quire Pass is a gnawed bone, Kenneth," Fraser said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "The MacRaes lost it, you held it. But holding it cost men, supplies and peace. My men have seen strange activity there, shadows that were not dear. Perhaps it is time to reconsider your control." The room grew quieter. The mention of the MacRaes made some men exchange glances. The history of Quire, of the blizzard, and the 3 dead men was still a ghost in the region. A ghost the Camerons preferred to ignore, and the MacRaes would never forget. Kenneth did not move. His voice, when it came, was low, raspy from the wind and disuse, but it cut through the air like a blade. "Reconsider for whom, Fraser? For you?" Fraser kept his smile, but his eyes narrowed. "For the safety of all. A single clan, isolated in that gorge, is a target. Sharing the responsibility would strengthen the region." "The region is strong as long as I say it is," Kenneth replied without changing his tone. "Quire is Cameron. Those who move there will be treated as invaders. The decision is made." The finality in the words was absolute. There was no room for debate, for negotiation. It was a fact, like the mountain rock. Fraser swallowed hard, the smile vanishing. He took a step back, yielding before that pure force of will. But resentment shone in his gaze. It was then that Dougal, who had been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, spoke. His loyalty was unquestionable, but his tongue was sharp, sending more men to watch the pass now with winter knocking at the door. "It stretches our resources, Kenneth. The Frasers might just be provoking us, wanting us to spend our strength while they stay warm in their valleys." All eyes turned to Kenneth. Questioning the Laird, even coming from a loyal cousin, was rare. Kenneth turned his head slowly. His icy gaze met Dougal's and held it. There was no wrath in the look, only a frozen intensity, a weight that felt physical. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any shout. It stretched for seconds that felt like minutes. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Dougal was the first to look away, lowering his head in an almost imperceptible gesture of submission. He said nothing more. The message was understood by everyone in the room. No one confronted him twice. Kenneth turned back to the group. "The watch at Quire will be doubled. I myself will lead an inspection tomorrow at dawn. I want to see with my own eyes what these shadows are, Fraser." He looked at the man who was already retreating. "Your men are welcome to join, to show this unity you prize so much." It was an order, not an invitation, and it was a trap. If Fraser refused, it showed his bad faith. If he accepted, he would place his men under Kenneth's direct command. Fraser gave a short, tense nod. "Some of mine will go." Without further ceremony, Kenneth gave a single nod, ending the council. The men began to disperse, the low voices returning, laden with a new nervousness. Outside, leaning against the cold corner of the grain storage house, Agnes watched. She had not been invited to the council, a MacRae woman never would be, but the village's stone walls had ears, and whispers travelled fast. She had heard enough. Quire, dawn inspection. Her heart, an organ she had trained to beat calmly, raced against her will. She knew every curve, every treacherous cliff, every place where snow accumulated into deadly cornices in that pass. She knew the paths that not even deer used. She knew it with the painful intimacy of someone who had lost part of her soul there. She saw the men leave the main house. She saw Fraser's stiff posture, the visible frustration in his abrupt steps. She saw Dougal come out, his face closed, followed by other Cameron warriors talking in low, serious voices. Finally, she saw Kenneth. He came out alone, an immediate point of focus. The weak, late afternoon light accentuated the hard lines of his face, the relentless determination in his bearing. His eyes scanned the yard, not with curiosity, but with the tactical assessment of a man who always looked for threats. For an instant, his gaze seemed to pass over the corner where she stood. Agnes held her breath, thinking in an irrational rush that those blue eyes could see through stone and shadow. They passed right by. He did not see her, because no one saw her. A familiar, bitter sting pricked her, but it was quickly replaced by a new and more urgent sensation, a chill at the base of her spine that had nothing to do with the wind. She felt something was wrong. Agnes pressed her arms around her body, as if she could contain the anxiety growing within her. She should keep quiet. It was what she always did. To speak meant drawing attention, and attention meant pain. Besides, why care? He was a Cameron, the Laird of the clan that her family's history painted with the colors of misfortune. Letting fate run its course in the mountains would be a poetic and cruel justice, but the image of snow stained with red, a memory that was not hers, but that her Aunt Mary had etched into her mind with cutting words, rose before her eyes, the image of men abandoned to the cold. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to banish the thought. In the distance, Kenneth gave sharp orders to two of his men, his voice carrying on the wind like a metallic sound. He then turned and walked toward the stables, his red and dark green tartan disappearing into the growing gloom. The village withdrew, doors closing against the night cold. Agnes finally pulled away from the corner of the wall, her limbs stiff from immobility and contained tension. The walk back to the cabin was made in haste, head down, her face a mask of stone until she crossed the threshold. Inside, the warm air thick with dried herbs enveloped her. Her eyes, which had remained dry and distant all. Day now burned. The redness around them and the slight flush on her nose were the only witnesses to the silent weeping that had overtaken her on the way. A humiliation transformed into hot salt, shed only where no one could see. Mary, her great-aunt, was leaning by the hearth stirring a thin broth. Her old eyes, filled with the shadows of 7 decades in the mountains, scanned Agnes's face and stopped. The old woman did not comment on the reddened eyes. Instead, she raised the wooden ladle. "The broth is hot. It will warm you from the inside, Monikian," she said, her voice as rough as willow bark, but gentle in intent. It was her way of giving comfort, practical, silent, without forcing the heart to speak. "Thank you, Aunt," Agnes murmured, accepting the bowl. The hands that received it were steady but cold. The warmth of the vessel did not penetrate the ice she felt in her gut, but for Agnes, a dangerous door had opened within her, the door of premonition. She perceived with a clarity that terrified her that something was going to go terribly wrong, and for the first time in many years, the idea of remaining invisible, safe in her corner of shadow, seemed not a protection, but a condemnation. The wind howled outside, battering against the window. Agnes opened her eyes. Outside only darkness and the promise of frost, but inside her a terrible and clear light had been lit. Something terrible seemed to pervade the air, an imminent danger that made her shudder. Dawn in Quaerfoire brought no light, only a sinister pallor. Before reaching that distant pass, Agnes had closed the low door of the cottage, leaving behind the fragile warmth of the fire and the heavy breathing of Mary, asleep under worn blankets. She had set out as she had so many times before the village woke, heading beyond the makeshift fences and familiar fields, advancing until the terrain ceased to offer shelter and began to demand courage. Now there the snow, which had begun as scattered flakes during the night, fell in dense, silent layers, erasing recent trails, blurring the contours of the mountains, and muffling any sound other than the persistent howl of the wind tearing through the rocky crevices. The air was frozen steel that bit into the lungs with every breath. Agnes walked with her head down against the gale, her steps firm and sure on the ancient trails that only she and the wild animals still remembered to follow. This was territory far from the village, but not strange to her. She knew every dip hidden under the snow, every curve of the land where the ground gave way treacherously. It was also a place marked by absences that had never healed, a setting that demanded more from her than physical strength. The thick wool cloak, frayed at the edges, barely protected her from the biting cold. Strands of her light hair, the color of morning frost, escaped her hood and stuck damply to her pale face. In her already numb fingers, she held a small leather pouch nearly empty. The rhodiola rosea, the root necessary for Mary's winter tonics, was elusive. Perhaps it was buried under the deepest layer of snow. Perhaps winter had decided to take it this year. Still, Agnes pressed on. Being there was not a choice of comfort, but of necessity, and also a silent confrontation with old pains she had learned to traverse without ever naming. Then, a different sound broke in, the muffled silence. It was not the wind. It was a metallic, dull noise followed by a heavy thud. Agnes stopped, her hand instinctively going to the simple dirk she carried at her waist. Her breath formed rapid clouds in the frozen air. The sounds came from a detour off the main trail, a ravine where snow accumulated in swirls. Against all prudence, her feet led her there. What she saw made her breath catch. A chestnut horse, large in stature and nostrils flared in panic, stood, stuck neighing low, its saddle empty and stained with a dark, wet red. And a little further on, half buried in a mound of snow, dirtied by earth and pebbles, lay a man. Even from behind and motionless, he was immense. The tartan that covered him, a deep red and a dark green striped with black, shouted his identity against the deadly whiteness of the snow. Cameron. Agnes's heart took a violent leap against her ribs. She took a step forward, then another, her senses on high alert. The wind brought her the scent of iron, blood and the sweat of the horse. When she got close enough, she saw the wound, a deep laceration on the man's right flank below the ribs, where someone's blade had found its target. The tartan fabric was soaked where someone's blade had found its target. The tartan fabric was soaked and dark, and a red stain was still slowly spreading through the snow beneath him. With an effort that seemed Herculean, the man tried to turn. It was then that Agnes saw his face. Despite the mortal pallor, the dirt, and the pain that disfigured him, she recognized him. The hard lines of the jaw, the ember-colored hair now tangled and wet. The eyes, which she had only glimpsed from a distance, were closed, but the eyelids flickered. It was him, Kenneth Cameron, the Wolf of Lochaber, the most feared man in the Highlands, now brought down, bleeding his life into the snow of the same past that had sealed her family's fate. A wave of conflicting feelings hit her like a punch. Fear. Merely being near him was dangerous. Rancor. That tartan was the symbol of everything that had been denied to her, of the pain her aunt carried. Hesitation. It was easy. It was so easy to turn around, to let the cold and blood loss do the work. The justice of the mountains, wild and impersonal, would be fulfilled. She began to retreat one step. Kenneth moved his head, a muffled groan escaping his cracked lips. His eyes opened for an instant, unfocused, glassy. They passed over her, through her, without seeing her. He murmured something, the words slurred and broken by the cold and weakness. Mo Creech. The voice was a raspy, rough thing, laden with a pain so deep it was almost tangible. It was not the voice of a laird, of a warrior. It was the voice of a man at his limit. The Gaelic syllable, the language of pain and intimacy, hung in the frozen air between them, and it was that word, that broken humanity, that locked Agnes's feet. She stopped retreating. She looked at the man. She looked at the wound. She looked at the horse, startled but still there, a possibility. Her mind, trained in the practical logic of survival, began to calculate. If she left him there, he would die within hours, perhaps less. The snow would cover him, and only in the spring would they find his remains. If she saved him, everything would change. For her, for him, for the fragile balance of hatred between the clans. It would be a colossal risk, but the act of turning her back, of walking away, knowing she had condemned a man to the cold in Quaerfoire, would be to become the same as the ghost that haunted her family. It would be to ratify the abandonment. Agnes's breath came out in a white, decisive blast. There were no witnesses, only the wind, the snow, and a choice. She knelt in the snow beside him, her cloak forming a small barrier against the wind. Her hands, despite the cold, were steady as she pressed a handful of clean snow against the edge of the wound, wiping away some of the blood to assess the damage. The touch made Kenneth shudder, and his eyes opened again, this time resting on her. The focus was blurred, feverish. He saw light hair framing a pale, serious face, eyes of a strange, clear color that seemed to see everything. To his delirious mind, wounded by blood loss, she did not seem entirely real. She looked like a vision emerged from the blizzard, a frost-haired Bansaith come to guide him, to rest or to salvation, he did not know. "Falid me," he murmured, the words losing themselves. "I will follow." "No." Agnes's voice rose, low but clear, cutting through his delirium. It was the first word she addressed to him, a simple command. "You are going to get up." She stood up and went to the horse. She spoke to it in low, calm tones, stroking its sweaty neck until the animal stopped trembling. It was a war stallion, but the delicate situation of its master had left it in a panic. With precise movements, she checked the harness. It was intact. Returning to Kenneth, she grabbed him under the shoulders. He was an immense burden, heavy with muscle and inertia. "Help me," she ordered, with no room for pleading. "If you want to see another dawn, help me now." The female voice, melodious but firm, carrying an unexpected authority, seemed to penetrate the fog of his pain. A glint of recognition, of pure stubbornness, lit up for an instant in his eyes. With a grunt that was pure agony, he strained, pushing with his legs, leaning on her. It was a joint effort, desperate and intimate. She felt the tremendous strength contained within him, even weakened. She felt the heat of his body against hers, the metallic smell of sweat and wet wool. Her face was just inches from his, and she saw the copper strands of his beard, the deep furrows of pain around his mouth. With jerks and starts, he stood up, staggering, nearly knocking her over with his weight. Agnes did not yield. She guided him, dragging step to the horse. With a last reserve of strength that seemed to come from nowhere, he managed to put his foot in the stirrup, and she pushed him up, him slumping over the animal's neck like a sack of grain. Agnes took the reins with steady hands. A cottage, former property of her family, almost forgotten in the clan records, stood less than a kilometre away, hidden by a whim of geography on a high plateau, tucked into the flanks of the pass. Off, the trail of shepherds and hunters. Few knew of its existence. It was their only chance. The path there was a blind crossing through snow and biting wind. She walked ahead, pulling the horse firmly, feeling the weight of Kenneth as if every step carried a silent oath. The Laird murmured disconnected words in Gaelic, broken by the wind. Agnes did not allow herself to look back. Every forward movement was a choice between guilt and courage, and every lament of the sky seemed to whisper, "Mad, mad, mad." When the stone and wood structure revealed itself among the pines bent by the storm, solid, silent, and almost ancestral, Agnes felt her shoulders lighten, as if the very roots of the earth were offering her refuge. The cabin was not an abandoned shelter. It was a reliquary. It had belonged to her grandparents, and since her parents' death, she returned there in secret to gather rare herbs, recall memories, and keep alive some bond that time tried to erase. Therefore, despite its modest appearance, the interior was minimally preserved, like someone tending an altar to the past. The door creaked, but gave way to her push. Inside, the air was cold, yes, but not unhealthy. The smell was of old stone, dry wood, and hanging herbs, familiar scents for someone who had already sought consolation within those walls. A black stone hearth dominated the center, with recent ashes indicating visits not so long ago. There was a pile of dry firewood, glass jars, capped with corks, and a wooden cot covered by clean furs carefully arranged. On a shelf, teas and ointments. It was there that she led him, with the delicacy of one delivering a secret. Dismounting him from the horse was an exercise in strength and faith. Kenneth fell onto the furs with a dull groan, his face pale against the dark wool. Agnes closed the door, sealing them in that hidden sanctuary. The howl of the wind became a distant murmur. There, between familiar stones and the memory of silenced generations, there were only the two of them, the forgotten heiress of a ruined clan, and the man who once represented everything she had sworn never to see again. But the debt, now, was sealed. The rescue was over. The true challenge, keeping life pulsing in that body, was only beginning. The hours began to lose their shape as soon as Agnes closed the wooden door behind her. The world outside, the pass, the biting wind, the ancient weight of the mountains, was reduced to a distant sound, muffled by the thick stones of the cabin. Inside, time began to be measured by other things, by his breath, by the fire. The first night was a vigil without rest. When she had dragged him inside alone, his body had barely responded. Her hands had trembled as she undid the thick tunic, but not from fear, from cold. A cold that ached in her fingers, that forced her to keep the fire burning even when her eyes felt heavy. She had cleaned the wound with melted snow and applied the infusion of achlasen with the same precision with which her mother, so many years before, had treated a wounded shepherd. She melted clean snow in a small pot, waiting patiently until the water reached the right temperature. She tore strips of linen from a dress kept there. There was no hesitation in that, and organized everything within reach before starting. Every gesture had been repeated in her mind many times throughout her life, learned first in maternal whispers, then reinforced by Mary's silent discipline. When she removed the improvised bandage and began the care, her face did not change. There was no recoiling, no false delicacy, only focus, the kind of attention that is born of necessity and respect for life, not of fear. As she worked, Kenneth watched her in the rare moments when consciousness emerged from the fog of fever. His eyes, cloudy and heavy, followed her movements as if they were the only solid thing in a world that threatened to dissolve. He saw pale, thin hands, marked not by idleness but by use, small calluses, discreet scars, moving with an almost reverent certainty. He saw the light hair escape its simple binding and fall in loose strands over her concentrated face, as if light itself had unraveled there inside the cabin. She spoke little. When she spoke, it was to herself. Constant heat. The infusion only after... Keep it clean. The voice was low, firm, without a trace of doubt. She did not ask permission. She did not ask who he was. She did not bow to the reputation that preceded him. She treated him as a body to be saved, a problem to be solved. And strangely, this began to disarm him more than any gesture of deference ever had. In his world, men feared him, or they flattered him. She did neither. On the second day, the fever rose like a treacherous tide. Kenneth shivered under the furs, his body fighting against mixed memories and sensations. Words in Gaelic escaped him. In fragments, place names, echoes of battles, ancient voices calling for him. Quaerfua surfaced repeatedly, interwoven with faces that no longer existed. Agnes did not try to calm him with empty promises. She sat beside the cot on a low stool and began the patient ritual that would be repeated many times. With a cloth and a bowl of fresh water, she spent long periods moistening his forehead, neck, and wrists. The touch was constant, neutral, comforting only in its persistence. There was no rehearsed urgency there, only presence. When the chills came, she remained. When delirium took him, she anchored him. Kenneth slept, or sank somewhere deeper than sleep. Feverish, he sometimes murmured stray sounds, Gaelic words that seemed to belong more to an ancient time than to that moment. Lochaber, Mo Brathair, Marbhad, fragments, shadows, no please. She did not answer. She only placed the cool cloth on his forehead and sat there, feet together and hands resting in her lap, looking at the fire as if it could speak to her. The second cycle brought a higher fever. Violent chills took hold of his body. His eyes sometimes opened only to show they were empty of reason. Agnes did not move away. She moistened his lips with drops of water and warm herbs. She changed the bandages with delicacy and speed, talking to herself in a low voice. Still too hot. Must go down before dawn. Her touch was constant, her gaze attentive. Sometimes she stopped to observe him. The full beard, the cracked lips, the forehead that furrowed even in sleep. He was a handsome man, very much so. But that was not what made her hesitate sometimes with the wet cloth between her fingers. It was the weight of his name, Cameron, the name she had learned to fear in silence. It was after dusk on that second day, when the fever subsided for a brief and deceptive interval, that he opened his eyes with more clarity. It was only for moments, in the twilight of the night. The logs crackled slowly. Agnes's back was turned, dressed only in the greyish-green wool dress without her cloak. Her loose hair fell almost to her waist, slightly tangled by the heat of the fire and the effort of the last few days. The light danced over her thin figure, outlining her shoulders, the subtle curve of her waist, the arch of her neck. She slowly stirred the broth with a wooden spoon, and every now and then she touched her own hair, brushing it from her face with distracted gestures. Kenneth watched. His eyes were still misty, but perception had returned enough for her image to fix itself as something almost sacred. For a moment he thought he was dreaming. Was this not that woman from the village, about whom everyone whispered? The silver-haired MacRae, the clanless witch? The one who, they said, was born of an ancient pact, perhaps with the Ios Sea themselves, the beings of the hills. A cruel fable. But what he saw was a woman, fragile, and determined, with eyes of wet moss and the serene mouth of one who learned to be silent before speaking, a woman who cared for him as if he were part of the ground she walked on, without fear, without reverence, and perhaps, for that very reason, with something stronger than any faith. Agnes was in profile, leaning over a small iron pot suspended over the embers. She stirred the contents with a wooden spoon, attentive to the exact point. The fire cast an amber light that outlined her figure, transforming the light strands of her hair into something almost unreal, as if they were made of golden mist. Her long eyelashes cast soft shadows on her cheekbones, and the absolute concentration in her features gave her a serenity he had never associated with any woman in his world. The rumors danced in Kenneth's clouded mind, uninvited. Witch. The ghost-haired MacRae. And yet, what he saw did not fit any of those words. That silent figure, tending to a man who represented everything that should be her enemy, carried no malice. There was only a terrible and resolute calm, the calm of one who does not expect recognition. MOCKED. The word escaped him like a breath, weaker than the crackling of the wood. It was not a call nor a confession. It was a reflection of his feverish soul, a formless thought that had become sound. My heart, or my affliction. The ancient tongue mixed pain and reverence in the same space. Agnes stopped the movement of the spoon. She did not turn immediately, but her shoulders rose in a minimal, almost imperceptible gesture. She had heard. He saw the delicate line of her nape, her pale skin contrasting with the loose strands of hair. Then, slowly, she turned. Her eyes, of that undefined color between moss and melted snow, met his. There was no reproach there, no alarm, only a quiet, almost clinical assessment, as if she were measuring not the weight of the words, but the state of the man who had uttered them. "The fever is breaking," she said, breaking the dense silence that had formed. "You must drink." She approached with a wooden bowl from which a discreet steam rose. The broth was simple, made from what she had found. Water, a handful of forgotten barley, winter-resistant roots. Still, the aroma carried something essential: sustenance, continuity, life. Agnes knelt beside the cot. She did not need to help him beyond holding the bowl steady. Kenneth managed to prop himself, up on his elbows alone, the effort evident in the tension of his arm muscles. She remained there, stable, allowing him to maintain the dignity of the gesture. Proximity was inevitable. She felt his heat, not the heat of the fire, but another, deeper, more human. A heat that carried the scent of wool, herbs, and skin. Her fingers almost touched his around the bowl. Her gaze, lowered and concentrated, fell for an instant on the strong line of his jaw, the firm curve of his lips as he drank, the broad wrist marked by the worn copper of an ancient bracelet. When she pulled away, it was too fast. She turned to the fire as if seeking air. Her heart beat at a strange, accelerated rhythm that had nothing to do with physical effort. It was the confusion of seeing the myth reduced to a man, of seeing the strength that held Lochaber in awe now dependent on her hands for a sip of broth. There was grandeur in him, even in weakness, a breadth of shoulders that promised shelter, a solidity that spoke of sleeping strength, not extinct. The attraction this awakened was not immediate nor vulgar. It was born of silent admiration, of dangerous curiosity. In the following days, the cabin began to change. Agnes swept the dirt floor. She rearranged the furs. She stacked firewood within reach. She hung herbs to dry in a corner. The smell of must gave way to the clean smoke of pine and the bitter notes of medicinal plants. The space ceased to be just a shelter and became habitable. Kenneth watched everything. He watched the way she moved in the small space, every gesture with purpose. He watched her sitting by the door, sewing a tear in his cloak by the dim light of day, her fingers agile, focused. The tension between them was no longer just that of the sick man and the caregiver. It was the tension of two worlds confined within four walls. When he began to regain strength, the change was gradual. First, he managed to sit up on his own, then to stand for brief moments. Agnes always remained nearby, without touching but ready. Her care was never invasive, only attentive. It was on the third morning, when he seemed to be sleeping, that she leaned in to check the bandage. The touch came suddenly. His fingers closed around her wrist. Agnes froze. There was no force, only intention. His thumb pressed lightly on the inside of her wrist, and the world seemed to narrow to that point. The fire, the wind, the time. Everything receded. Kenneth was staring at her, awake, present. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Their eyes lost themselves in each other for seconds that seemed suspended in time. Agnes felt her heart race inside her chest. She broke contact first, turning her gaze to the pot on the fire on the other side of the cabin. "The fever seems to have broken," she said, her voice a little lower than usual. "You need nourishment." She served the broth in a wooden bowl and approached. This time he managed to sit up alone, leaning against the stone wall behind the cot. The effort was great, and a cold sweat washed over his face, but he did it. When she held out the bowl, their hands met. Hers, thin and delicate, holding the base. His, broad and marked by scars and calluses, wrapping around the side of the bowl. The touch was brief but electric, a shock of reality, of human warmth that traveled up her arm. He saw a subtle flush rise up her neck, staining her pale skin a nearly lovely pink. He drank the broth. It was simple. Water, a handful of found barley, wild roots she must have gathered. But it was hot, salty, invigorating, the taste of survival. "Thank you," he said, his voice still raspy from disuse and fever. They were his first conscious words to her. She only nodded, collecting the bowl. But he saw something in her eyes, a quick glint, a confusion, before she turned away again. As the hours passed, a new dynamic emerged. Kenneth was awake longer. He watched. He watched how she organized every inch of the cabin, transforming the Spartan shelter into a place that, if not comfortable, was deeply habitable. She swept the floor with a broom of branches, arranged the furs, and kept a corner with melted snow for fresh water. Everything was done with an economy of movement that was almost a dance. He also began to speak. Little, only what was necessary. "How long?" he asked one morning, watching her examine. "The bandage." "4 days," she replied without looking up. "My horse?" "He is in the shelter next door. He ate the fodder. He is well." Her answers were always like that. Direct, true, unadorned. He began to yearn for these brief exchanges. Her soft voice was a fixed point in the unstable world of his convalescence. Physical proximity, though never purposeful, became increasingly charged. The cabin was small. To pass, she sometimes had to slide close to the bed, her dress lightly, brushing against the furs that covered him. When she knelt to check the fire, he could see the delicate profile of her face illuminated by the embers, the concentration in her features. Once, reaching for more bandages on the shelf above the bed, her arm passed over his shoulder. He felt the heat of her body, the clean smell of smoke and herbs in her hair. She stood still for a second, then finished the movement and pulled away without a word. But the image of her, so close, with her, eyes wide for a moment of surprise, remained etched in his mind. He also began to notice the small things, how she softly bit her lower lip when concentrated, how she sometimes whispered to herself in Gaelic while preparing the herbs, a soft and familiar cadence that calmed him, how her hands, though marked by work, had an innate grace in every movement, and Agnes, for her part, felt observed in a new way. It was not the village's look of contempt. It was a heavy, attentive gaze that seemed to notice every detail. At first it made her nervous, but gradually under that silent gaze, a part of her that had long been dormant began to awaken. She saw his strength returning, the way he sat up now with a posture that already spoke of command, even at rest. She saw the imposing nature of his body, the breadth of his shoulders that promised a protection she had never known. There was a physical attraction that frightened her, not for its intensity, but for its novelty. She had never thought of a man in this way. She had never been allowed to. And more dangerous still, there was admiration for his silent endurance, for the way he accepted her care without arrogance, only with a kind of resigned respect. He was a leader, and she could see the signs even in his infirmity, the way he analyzed the environment, how he weighed his few words. He was a man who carried the world, and seeing him so close, so human, awakened in her something deep and... That afternoon, while he slept a more peaceful sleep, she sat by the half-open door. The cold winter light streamed in, illuminating the interior. She looked at him, asleep, his face finally relaxed, his breathing deep and steady. The wound was healing, his strength was returning, and with it, the world would return. The clan. The duty. A knot of anticipated pain tightened in her chest. Separation was inevitable, as certain as the rising of the sun. This cabin, this time suspended outside of reality, had its days numbered. She knew it with the same certainty she knew that fire needed wood. The knowledge did not stop her from recording every detail, the sound of his breath, the shadow of his eyelashes on his face, the rare peace in his features while he slept. She turned to the fire, feeding it another log. The flames rose, casting heat and light. The cabin was warm, organized, smelling of healing and care. For a brief and stolen moment it had been an entire world, but the stone walls could not keep it forever. Moonlight would give way to dawn, and with it, the hour of impossible choices would come. The morning of the 5th day arrived with a cold, clear light that entered through the cracks of the cabin. For the first time since the blizzard, the wind had stopped howling. The silence was profound, laden with a strange and tense peace. Kenneth was sitting on the cot, exercising his wounded shoulder with careful movements. The pain was now a dull memory, not a searing presence. Strength returned to his limbs, and with it, the crushing weight of reality. Agnes was by the fire, preparing the morning broth. Her profile against the light was a familiar silhouette, an anchor in the recent turbulent days. He watched her, and a question that had been haunting his mind since the first moment of lucidity finally found a voice. "How did you find me?" His voice, still a bit raspy, broke the silence. "In that ravine. How did you know I would be there?" She did not stop stirring, but her fingers slowed on the wooden spoon. "I didn't know," she replied, her voice soft as always. "I was looking for a root. It grows on those slopes only at this time, but—" She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "That day I felt an urgency to go there. A premonition. I can't explain it. It's something that sometimes happens." She served the broth in a bowl and approached, holding it out to him. He accepted it, his fingers meeting hers for a brief instant. He held her with his gaze, a slight, discreet and teasing smile forming at the right corner of his lips. "A premonition," he repeated, his tone softly intrigued. "Is it common for that to happen?" "Sometimes." Agnes served the broth into the bowl and brought it to him, extending her hand with silent gentleness. "Do you use magic?" The question did not have the harshness of an accusation. There was a genuine curiosity, tinged with a soft provocation. "Are you trying to bewitch me with this preparation?" Agnes, paralyzed. Fear, old, familiar, froze her features for a second. Her eyes widened, and he saw the conditioned reflex of years of insults in that look. But then she looked at his face, at the faint glint in his blue eyes, at the smile that was not cruel. He was teasing. The understanding hit her like a warm wave, melting the rigidity. An almost inaudible sigh escaped her lips. "It would take much more potent ingredients," she said, her voice a bit firmer, though still low, "for an enchantment capable of bewitching a man of your stature, Laird Cameron." Kenneth laughed. It was a low and surprising sound that came from his chest like something long forgotten. The sound made something inside Agnes contract, not from fear, but from a strange joy. "Perhaps," he said, the smile still on his lips as he took a sip of the broth. "But you succeeded. When I woke up here in the first few days, I thought you were a Bansith, one of the women of the cedar, come from the mists to take me or save me." He looked at her, the humor giving way to a more serious, contemplative expression. With such beautiful hair and this gentle calm that causes a strange fascination. Agnes felt the heat rise violently up her neck and face. She looked away, concentrating on her hands in her lap. The shyness, the confusion were visible. Kenneth watched her, and for the first time he thought not of his own vulnerability, but of hers. How many times had she heard cruel comments about her appearance, about her skills? How many times had she been called a witch with contempt, not with this almost affectionate lightness? The idea sparked a flash of protectiveness within him, something he hadn't felt for anyone in a long time. He finished the broth and set the bowl aside. Silence returned, but it was a different silence, laden with a new awareness between them. "I must return," he said, his voice soft but final. "My clan must think I am dead. They must be looking for me, but they don't know this place. Those who attacked me, they may be moving." Agnes only nodded. She knew. She had been expecting this since the first day. "I will go with you to the exit of the valley," he continued, standing up. It was still a somewhat careful movement, but he was on his feet, imposing himself in the small space. "It is not safe for you to stay here alone." "The place is familiar to me, Laird," she replied, also standing. There was a touch of resilient pride in her voice, a thread of steel beneath the softness. "I learned to take care of myself very early, and it would not be good for people to see the MacRae witch returning at the side of a Cameron. It would ruin your reputation." She tried a slight smile, but it did not reach her eyes. His words were kind, but hers were a blow of reality. He saw the wisdom in them and also the loneliness of an entire life built around discretion and survival. "Be careful as you return," she added, her tone serious again. "You are still not fully recovered, and someone clearly wished to do you harm." He looked at her in silence, feeling the full weight of her words. She had not only saved him, she understood the power game, the danger. That understanding, coming from her, was more valuable than any warning from his warriors. The moment of departure arrived. He dressed in what remained of his clothes. She handed him his cloak, now clean and dry. Every gesture was a silent goodbye. Outside, the air was freezing but still. The snow covered everything with an intact, brilliant mantle. His horse was rested, fed. He readied the animal, his movements slow from the wound, but determined. Agnes stood still at the door of the cabin, her hands clasped in front of her simple dress. She looked like a part of the landscape, pale and quiet, her eyes fixed on him. He mounted, feeling the familiarity of the saddle, the weight of the sword at his waist once again. It was like putting on an old skin. He looked at her one last time. The image of those days, her cold hands, her calm voice, her hair like threads of moonlight, burned in his mind. The attraction he felt was not just physical. It was an attraction to all her stillness, her silent strength, her inner world that he had barely begun to glimpse. He pulled the reins. The horse took a step. Then he stopped. He dismounted with a more fluid movement than he expected. He walked back to her, and she remained standing, motionless, her light eyes huge in her face. He stopped before her. Without a word, he took her hands in his. They were cold, thin hands, marked by life. He turned them, palms down, and bowed his head. With a solemnity that made her heart stop, he placed a soft, silent, and warm kiss on the back of each one. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice deep and laden with an emotion he would not name. He raised his eyes, catching her gaze. "For everything." The tears Agnes had fought to contain filled her eyes, making them shine like wet glass in the winter light. She did not let them fall. She only nodded once quickly and looked down at the ground, unable to bear the intensity of that moment for another second. He smiled, a soft and sad smile, mounted his horse again, and rode away, without looking back. Hearing him leave was a physical pain. The sound of hooves in the snow became fainter, then disappeared, swallowed by the immense silence of the mountains. Agnes stood at the door for a time she could not measure. The heat of his lips still seemed to burn her skin. The cabin, which for days had been a world, now felt empty and cold. She methodically put out the fire and gathered her few things into the herb basket. Before leaving, she took one last walk across the plateau, gathering some late roots with automatic movements. Her hands trembled slightly. When she finally walked away from the cabin, carrying her basket and the weight of a silent change within her, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. She had touched the myth, and the myth had seen her. The walk back to the village was long and lonely under a leaden sky that promised more snow. By the time the first lights of the cabins appeared in the distance, she had already recomposed her mask of stone, but something in her eyes, a new depth, refused to fade completely. Her entrance into the village was observed. Heavy, suspicious gazes followed her from the fence to the alley that led to her cottage. No one greeted her. No one asked where she had been. It was the usual invisibility, but today she felt the weight of every gaze like a small blow, brutally contrasting with the intensity of the gaze that had held her just hours before. The door of her cottage creaked as it opened. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of freshly baked barley bread. MacRae was standing near the hearth, and upon seeing Agnes, her wrinkled face, usually so composed, dissolved into a mixture of deep relief and repressed anxiety. "Monigan!" The old woman's voice cracked. She crossed the small room in quick steps, her bony hands clutching Agnes's shoulders as if to make sure she was real. "You went out to gather herbs and vanished. Where have you been?" "5 nights. My heart was fearing the worst." "I'm fine, Aunt," Agnes said, her voice sounding tired to her own ears. She placed the herb basket on the table. "I stayed at the old cabin in the pass. The snow, it fell hard. It prevented my return. I had to wait." Mary studied her face, her sharp eyes losing themselves not in the dirt or fatigue, but in the new shadow in her eyes. "Are you truly well? Have you eaten?" "Yes." Agnes gestured to the basket. "I got good roots. For your winter tonic." Mary nodded, but her worry did not dissipate. She turned to place the kettle over the embers, her movements deliberate. "While you were away, the village has been in an uproar. Laird Cameron disappeared. After an inspection of Choir Fouar, his men returned without him. They say there was an ambush. Everyone thinks—" She paused and looked over her shoulder. Did you see anything out there?" The question hung in the warm air. Agnes froze for a second, her hands hovering over the herbs in the basket. The truth was a heavy, warm burden in her chest. She took a deep breath. "I found him," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. Mary turned completely, the kettle forgotten. "What?" "I found him, wounded, almost dead in the ravine of Choir Fouar." The words came out now in a low and steady flow. "I took him to the cabin, tended to his wounds. As soon as he recovered enough, he returned home. This morning," Mary's face lost all color. Her eyes widened, not with anger, but with a deep maternal terror. "My dear, you were alone with that man, in that desolate place. For heaven's sake, Agnes." "I only tended to his wounds, Aunt," Agnes insisted, her voice gaining a little strength. "He was dying, I couldn't—" "But our families—" Mary interrupted, the pain of decades tightening her voice. "The old blood, the distrust." "I know, Aunt," Agnes whispered, her eyes welling up. "I know. But I couldn't leave him there to die, I just couldn't." The silence that followed was deep. Mary watched her niece, the quiet child who had grown up under the weight of a dishonored name, the resilient woman who had never answered hatred with hatred. She saw the raw honesty in her eyes and something else, a new and fragile vulnerability that left her heart aching. The old woman approached, her anger giving way to even deeper concern. Her voice dropped to a soft, urgent tone. Did he do you any harm, Monikian? Did he offend you?" Agnes shook her head, a firm negative. An image of the kiss on her hands, of the intensity of his gaze, flashed through her mind. But that was her secret, a precious and confusing jewel kept under lock and key. "No, Aunt. He was kind, and he said thank you. He did not hurt me at any time." She looked down at her hands in her lap, as if she could still feel the warmth of the contact. "I even thought he might be hostile when he woke up and saw me there, but he wasn't. He was kind." Mary sighed, a sound that came from the depths of her years. She placed a wrinkled hand on Agnes's face. "A good heart in a hard world is both a gift and a burden," she murmured, more to herself. "Now you must rest, and pray that his kindness was not just a reflection of weakness." Agnes nodded, exhausted to the bone. But as she bathed and prepared to rest, she knew it wasn't prayers for Kenneth's character that occupied her heart. It was the memory of his voice, the echo of his low laughter, and the silent, warm mark of his lips on her skin. Memories that, in her grey and hostile world, shone with the dangerous and tempting intensity of a stolen fire. Kenneth Cameron crossed the boundaries of his lands like a returning ghost. The news of his appearance spread faster than fire in straw. Men ran out to meet him, their faces a mixture of relief, shock, and guilt. Dougal was the first to reach him, his face pale beneath his red mustache. "For heaven's sake, Kenneth, we thought—" He swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the scarred face and the careful posture of the Laird. "What happened?" "An ambush. In Choir Fouar," Kenneth replied, his voice back to its usual rasp, but more tired. "Men sent with precise instructions, traitors within our own borders." Dougal caught his breath, his jaw tightening. "Who?" Kenneth looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then he looked away like one, calculating a chess move. "If you suspect Fraser, we will confront him. Everyone knows Fraser has an interest in the region. And for that very reason, he thinks I will face him with the sword. But men like Fraser do not fear blades. They fear witnesses. So what are you going to do? Observe. Wait. I will know when the time is right to speak. He knew. From the moment he had opened his eyes in the cabin, amidst the smell of moss and medicine, he knew who had ordered the attack. A name haunted him in the dark. Fraser. The man who smiled too easily, who yearned for the reins of the clan with an urgency disguised as loyalty, but Kenneth would not confront him with words. Not yet. It was more effective to wait. Listen, observe, and let the poison return to the traitor's own mouth. Where have you been for so many days? I was found and healed when I was at the threshold of life. By whom? Dougal's question was quick, suspicious. Kenneth hesitated. Her name. Still burned on his tongue, but he would not utter it. There were things that belonged to silence, for now. By someone who has no interest in this dispute, he said, evasive. That does not matter now. Fraser made his move. The clan must know I am alive, and that there is a debt to be settled. As he was led to the main house, sidelong glances and whispers followed him. The relief was real, but beneath it, Kenneth felt the underground current of jealousy, of clan politics, of the old distrust toward the MacRaes that Agnes had mentioned with such wounded pride. The internal conflict grew within him, the duty of a Laird, which demanded ruthless strength and distrust, and the memory of a silent room, of gentle hands, and a beauty that defied all rumors. He entered his house, the weight of Lochaber descending upon his shoulders once more. But somewhere, beneath the burden of leadership and pending revenge, a new and restless space had opened, a space occupied by the sound of a soft voice, by the glimpse of frost-colored hair, and by the silent memory of a kiss given to hands that knew how to work, to care, to heal, not to make war. Nearby, Fraser was at the front of a small meeting in the stable, gathering 3 of the stewards to discuss the supplies that were to depart for the next trade between allied clans. He spoke with moderate excitement, like one who wishes to appear useful or necessary. He was interrupted by a hurried stomping of boots on the dirt. A breathless young squire ran up to him. "Master Fraser, the Laird, he has returned. He is alive. He arrived on horseback by the road that leads to the pass." For an instant, Fraser's eyes faltered, a fraction of a second, a twitch at the corners of his mouth. Then he composed himself, forcing a tense smile. "Thank God," he murmured, loud enough for the others to hear. What a relief. The clan needs his leadership. But inside, a bolt of cold wrath pierced his stomach. Kenneth should be dead. Those men had failed. And now the Laird returned with scars, and eyes that perhaps knew too much. Fraser dismissed the assistants with some excuse about reorganizing the supplies, but his steps led him away from there. He needed to think. He needed to know what Kenneth remembered, and what he pretended to have forgotten. For the first time, he feared he was not in control of the board, and that, for a man like him, was unbearable. As the days passed, life in the village returned to its cruel and habitual flow for Agnes. The episode in the cabin seemed a distant memory, faded by the reality of gazes that passed through her body and whispers that followed her like shadows. She sought refuge in silent tasks and knowledge of the land, her only true ally. That afternoon, she headed to the woods east of the village, where certain tree barks, tenderer at the beginning of winter, could be gathered for an ointment. The silence among the tall pines was a relief. It was then that she heard an anguished sound, a low, persistent whimper. Following the sound, she found a young shepherd dog, not much more than a large puppy, its back leg caught in the crevice of a thick, twisted root that had fallen. The animal, frightened and exhausted, was trying to free itself, only worsening its situation. Its brown eyes were wide with panic. Without hesitation, Agnes knelt in the damp earth. She whispered in low, soothing tones, meaningless words, only the melody of tranquility. With slow and precise movements, she began to examine the trapped paw, trying to figure out how to release it without hurting it further. Her touch was gentle, her concentration absolute. What she did not see were the figures that had stopped among the trees watching. A group of young men from the village, led by an older and superstitious boy named Callum, who always repeated the worst stories about the MacRaes. They had come to hunt red squirrels but found a better distraction. "Look at that," whispered Callum, his face twisting in a mix of fear and disdain. "It's her, the witch. Look at how she speaks to the demon in the skin of a dog. Is she freeing an evil spirit? Asked a younger boy, his voice trembling. Worse, she's placing a curse on the animal. Who knows, perhaps to send it to attack our flocks later, Callum replied, his imagination poisoned by prejudice. That's what they do. My grandfather told me. Frost-colored hair is only born from a pact. Agnes, unaware, finally managed to release the dog's paw with extreme care. The animal gave a whimper, but then quickly licked her hand, a gesture of instinctive gratitude. A tiny smile, the first in days, touched Agnes's lips. It was this smile that they saw. "See?" shouted Callum, losing his composure and stepping partially out of the darkness of the trees. "She smiles at her handiwork." "Which?" Agnes raised her head, the smile dying on her lips. Her heart raced at the sight of the hostile faces. She stood up, taking a step back. The dog, sensing the tension, fled limping into the forest. "No, I only helped." Her voice failed, choked by that old acquaintance. "Injustice." "Helped!" Callum mimicked in a shrill voice. The others laughed, a nervous and cruel sound. One of the smaller boys, emboldened by the fear and the bravado of the group, reached down and picked up a loose stone from the ground. "Get out of here, witch! You'll bewitch our mothers!" the boy shouted and threw the stone. Agnes tried to dodge, but the stone grazed her right temple. The impact was dull and sharp. A line of fire streaked across her skin, and a thin, warm stream began to trickle down the side of her face. The world stopped for a second. The physical pain was acute, but insignificant compared to the violence of the act. Someone had hurt her, intentionally. Years of silent humiliation, of internalized contempt, broke an internal dam. A trapped sob exploded in her chest. She backed away, stumbling, tears of a deep and ancient sadness pouring from her eyes, mixing with the red thread on her face. She turned and began to run, blinded by pain and panic, plunging deeper into the woods away from the voices that were now shouting behind her, a mixture of triumph and youthful remorse. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs faltered. She did not see the path. She was simply fleeing from that new and terrible truth. She was not just invisible or despised, she was a target. Suddenly she slammed hard against something solid and immovable. The impact sent her reeling back, but two arms as strong as oak trunks caught her, preventing her from falling. She panted blindly, trying to break free, until her eyes, blurred by tears, looked up and met a gaze she knew. They were eyes of a deep blue like the sky before a storm, fixed on her with an intensity that cut through her flight. Fire-colored hair beneath the hood. Kenneth. He held her firmly, his face a mask of shock that quickly turned into growing concern as he saw the blood mixed with the tears on her pale face. He remained locked in her gaze for a long moment, seeing the fear, pain, and humiliation overflowing from those light eyes. With a delicacy that contrasted brutally with his imposing presence, he raised his free hand and, with his fingertips, gently wiped away a tear that ran down her cheek, avoiding the shallow cut. "Who?" His voice came low but laden with a latent danger that made the surrounding air feel colder. "Who was responsible for these tears?" Agnes tried to speak, but only broken sobs came out. She tried to pull away, but his arms enveloped her firmly, like a safe harbor. She was trembling violently. "Shh," he whispered, lowering his head close to hers. The heat of his breath hit her ear. "Do not run. You need not be afraid. Trust me. Just trust." It was as if those words broke the last remnant of control. A convulsive, deep cry, muffled against his tartan, took hold of Agnes. Years of lonely pain, of swallowed humiliation, of forced invisibility, surfaced like a broken dam. Her body shook with the force of the release. Kenneth held her tighter, wrapping her completely in his arms, protecting her from the world in the middle of that forest. He was deeply moved. He could feel not only the tremor of her body, but the pain of her shivering soul. An internal fury, cold and sharp, began to grow within him. The idea that people under his protection, on his lands, could hurt someone to the point of causing such a silent and profound lament was an affront to everything he understood as honor. A sudden breeze blew past them. It brought with it her scent, a blend of flowers, simple soap, and something more, a fresh and clean smell like snow in the air. It was a pure fragrance, intoxicating. in a way he had never experienced. It enveloped his senses, mixing with the feeling of her, small and broken in his arms. He realized, with a shock that was almost physical, that she was different from any woman he had ever seen. There was a truth in her, a total absence of artifice that awakened in him a new and overwhelming instinct, the instinct to protect, to harbor, to never again let this pain touch her. He waited for the convulsions of her weeping to diminish, for the sobs to become trembling sighs. His own heart beat with a wild force against his ribs, echoing the erratic rhythm of hers. When she finally calmed enough, he pulled back just enough to see her face. With a clean handkerchief he pulled from inside his plaid, he tenderly wiped the blood from the shallow cut on her temple. The touch was light as a feather. "Why?" he asked, his voice softer now, but the fury still burning in the depths of his eyes. "Why is this crying such a profound lament?" She took a deep breath, panting, unable to sustain his gaze for long. I always heard horrible things," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "But until today, no one had ever gone so far as to hurt me." He clenched his jaw. The muscles in his face tightened. "Tell me, who hurt you?" "It doesn't matter," she murmured, trying to look away. "It's already behind me. It matters to me." His statement came out sharp, final. It was then that they both heard it, hurried footsteps and muffled voices not far off, coming from the direction Agnes had fled. Young, frightened voices. Kenneth looked toward the sounds, then back at her. His eyes hardened. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice now that of the Laird, the commander. "Do not move." He left her leaning against the trunk of a large tree and, with long and silent strides, disappeared among the foliage. Kenneth found the group 50 paces away. Callum and 3 boys, all with stones still in their hands or recently discarded on the ground, were talking in agitated voices. One of them, the youngest, was crying softly. When they saw the figure that emerged from the forest like an angry ghost, wearing Cameron tartan, a mark of mortal authority in the woods, they all froze. "Laird Cameron!" Callum swallowed hard, straightening his posture. The others imitated him, looking at their feet. Kenneth stood before them. His gaze traveled over each face, each stone. On the ground, the guilty expressions. The silence he imposed was more terrifying than a scream. "What do you seek here?" His voice was flat, dangerously controlled. "Just hunting squirrels, Laird," stammered Callum. "With stones in your hands?" Kenneth asked, his voice now a blade. "Hunting squirrels, or hurting defenseless maidens?" The group fell into a silent panic. The boy who was crying let out a sob. We went after the witch, Laird," confessed one of the others, terrified by the man's presence. "She speaks to animals, casts spells, and that hair white as frost. It's a sign she isn't fully human. She's the daughter of the—" Crack! The sound was that of Kenneth's sword being unsheathed with a deadly fluidity. He did not raise it to strike, but the point of the shimmering blade pointed at the ground between him and the group, a clear symbol of his authority and his anger. "Listen to me, and listen well." His voice echoed, low but carrying. "Throughout the entire woods, there are no witches in my lands. No person, man, woman, or child deserves the contempt and cowardly violence you have demonstrated. Set aside your fantasies and stupid superstition." He paused, allowing each word, like a nail, to drive into them. "Agnes MacRae is a woman, a human, sweet, and incapable of committing the evils that your poisonous tongues invent. You have hurt her, with words for years, and today, with actions. This I will tolerate no longer." The youngest boy looked at Callum, his face pale with terror. Did she bewitch the wolf of Lochaber?" he whispered, involuntarily. Kenneth let out a sound that was not a laugh, something harsher. "I am under no spell, boy. I am under the command of my own reason, and it tells me that you are cowards. Now return to your homes." He raised the blade just a little, and the light broke on the steel. "And I reinforce, if any of you, or anyone who hears from you, dares to approach her, address an offensive word to her, or even look at her with disdain, you will have to answer to me. Is that clear?" The threat, spoken with glacial coldness, was scarier than any shout. The stones dropped from the remaining hands. Callum shook his head, unable to speak, and then, like a flock of startled birds, they turned and ran back toward the village, disappearing among the trees. Kenneth took a deep breath, the fury still throbbing in his veins. He sheathed his Sword. When he returned to the spot where he had left Agnes, his heart, still racing with anger, gave a different leap. She was gone. Only the mark of her back against the tree and, perhaps, a single footprint in the damp earth. She had fled again. Into the solitude she knew, far even from her protector. He stood still, the woods silent around him. Her scent still seemed to linger in the air. His heart raced in his chest, and for the first time in his life as a warrior and leader, Kenneth Cameron was left without understanding exactly what was happening inside him. He only knew that this creature with frost hair, with her silent pain and her broken strength, had stirred something very deep, something that went far beyond a blood debt, something that seemed to have roots in the very core of his soul. The loudest silence Agnes had ever heard didn't come from the absence of sound, but from the space between her own thoughts. It was there that he dwelt, sitting by the edge of the icy stream, where the water ran dark and fast over the stones. She ran her fingers through her own hair, untangling it mechanically. Memory, however, did not unravel so easily. He didn't need to have protected me, but he did. The image was clear, him emerging from the forest, his presence filling the empty space of her panic, his voice cutting like steel against the young men's ignorance. It hadn't been an act of duty. It hadn't been a Laird's obligation. That came from a deeper, more personal place. A choice. But he shouldn't approach me. This won't end well for either of us. The thought was a cold weight in her stomach. Her existence was a problem, her proximity to him, a scandal waiting to happen. She belonged to the shadows, not to the side of the sun. High atop the plateau overlooking the Fuar Pass, Kenneth watched the ravine below. The territory had been marked and watched for years, officially under Cameron rule. A tactical, empty victory. The weight he felt was not that of legal right, but of the history pulsing through those stones, and of a more recent, softer memory, the touch of her cold hands changing a bandage, her warmth trembling in his arms in the woods, her gaze overflowing with a pain he had sworn never to allow again. It wasn't just gratitude. Gratitude was a calculation, a transaction. What he felt had no name, but it had texture, scent, sound. It was the echo of her silence, the strength, contained in her gestures, the fragility she never admitted. Since that day in the woods, the other voices in his head, those of strategy, distrust, and raw power, had quieted. Only hers remained, a constant whisper that disturbed his peace and, paradoxically, was the only thing that brought him any. Restlessness, like the cold, seeped through the cracks. In a wealthier cabin in the village, not far from Cameron territory, a group of men gathered. They were older councillors from the MacRae clan and others from smaller clans, their faces marked by time and cautious ambition. At the centre, serving dark whiskey and even darker words, was Alistair Fraser. "Trust is like a wooden cup," Fraser said, swirling his own cup in his hand. "It may seem solid, but a crack, a constant pressure, and it falls apart." His eyes swept over the men. "Our Laird is distracted." "Distracted how?" asked one of the men, Tavish Murray with thick grey eyebrows. "With the MacRae." "Girl?" Fraser replied, letting the name hang like a foul stench. "The daughter of the traitor clan. He was seen with her in secret in the woods, and not in cordial conversation. They say he threatened boys from his own village to defend her. What kind of leader places the interests of a woman like that above the safety of his own?" The men exchanged meaningful glances. The murmur grew. "Perhaps it's not just distraction," Fraser insinuated, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone. "Perhaps it's manipulation. She is the daughter of those who lost Fuar, and now what does she want most? The lands back. Kenneth is the only obstacle. So she bewitches him, uses that spectral beauty, that air of a victim. She makes him lower his guard, soften his heart. And when he is vulnerable, she destroys us from within. It is a slow and sweet revenge. The poisonous and skillful words found fertile ground in ancient distrust and political jealousy. Fraser reinforced his alliance with two men who coveted the fertile lands near the pass. "Loyalty must be to the clan, not to a man," he argued. "If a leader loses his way, it is the duty of strong men to correct him, or anticipate the inevitable. I guarantee that with support, the redistribution of these lands will be fair, for those who truly deserve them." The promise, though vague, sparkled in the eyes of some. The seed of discord was planted. Under the leaden sky that hung over the fields, Kenneth led his horse along the edges of the woods, his eyes fixed on the irregular line of trees ahead, but his mind in disarray. He had spent the last few days trying to concentrate on Fraser's threats, the treacherous politics between clans, and the need to reinforce every flank of protection, but not even the imminence of war could erase the persistent figure that occupied his thoughts with stubborn constancy, Agnes, and it was as if the thought had summoned her presence. A subtle, almost imperceptible movement among the willow branches ahead caught his attention. He stopped the horse, pulling the reins slowly. The breeze carried a tense silence, and even the animal seemed to feel something different in the air. There she was, leaning against the trunk of the old willow, dressed in a grey shawl that seemed to steal her colours, but not her light. Agnes was gathering something near the roots, her gestures contained and soft, her hair, almost the same colour, as the clouds above, long and shining, escaped from her hood with the freedom of one who refuses to be tamed. There was a poetic melancholy in her presence, as if she were an ancient memory the whole world had forgotten, except him. Kenneth held his breath. Everything inside him ordered him to move on, to respect the invisible walls she built with words and gestures, to preserve himself from what he could not have, but he couldn't. He dismounted with a calm gesture, never taking his eyes off her. He released the reins so the horse could graze and with slow steps advanced through the dry leaves. Agnes heard him. She raised her face, her eyes meeting his without a start, as if she knew he would come. The exchange of glances between the two suspended time. Neither spoke for long seconds. It was as if the words there only hindered what the silence shouted. Kenneth stopped at a respectful distance, his eyes fixed on her with contained intensity. "You left that day? You fled? Why?" His voice came out lower than he intended. It wasn't an accusation, it was restlessness. "Are you well? Did someone hurt you again?" She lowered her gaze, her fingers fumbling with the roots in the basket, as if in them she sought an answer that didn't involve him. "I am well," she said almost in a whisper, "but it is better if you keep your distance. It is enough for me to be what I am. I don't want you to begin carrying the weight of my name as, well." That sentence, spoken with such serene resignation, pierced Kenneth like a well-aimed arrow. Something in her tone revolted him deeply, not because of her, but because of everything she seemed to have accepted as fate. He took a deep breath, his jaw set. "You are not a burden, Agnes." The firmness in his voice was new, but serene. "Neither to yourself, and certainly not to me." She breathed deeply, as if fighting the impulse to believe. Her eyes, however, revealed the conflict. There was gratitude, yes, but also fear of wanting more. Suddenly a distant noise broke the moment. A youth, Egan, nephew of one of Fraser's allies, was passing along a higher trail. His eyes widened at the sight of the Laird there, so close to the MacRae daughter. He didn't hear what was said, but he understood enough. He retreated stealthily, and then ran. He had something to tell his uncle. Agnes held the basket against her chest more tightly, as if she wanted to hide, her racing heart. Her eyes dropped to the damp earth, then rose again to his, where they remained trapped for too long. "Please," she said, with a held breath. "Walking away now is the greatest good you can do for me, and for yourself." He took a step, not a large one, but firm, an impulse contained for days, the desire to cross the space between them, to touch her face, to say everything his honor forbade him to confess. But the instant his feet moved, she stepped back. That movement, quick and instinctive, was not just a gesture, it was a decision, a wall. Kenneth stopped immediately. The silence returned, but now there was something new in it. Pain, an old pain, of one who had lost before, and did not want to lose again. She didn't need to say anything. Her eyes spoke for her. It was dangerous. For him, for her, for everything. But even so, even with the distance between their bodies, their gazes were still close. Eyes that shouted what lips stifled. Desire, longing, fear, will, respect, hunger for proximity, and a need for silence. He looked at her hair, loose and free, and the impulse to touch it almost overcame his reason. Almost. He looked at her lips, and an echo of a dreamed kiss seemed to throb on his skin, but he knew it wasn't the time. So with a soul heavier than his body, he stepped back. Then another. The horse still grazed nearby. Kenneth mounted, but did not leave immediately. He looked at her one last time. The look did not ask for an apology, nor did it plead. It only said, "If I could," and he left. In a steady trot, as if every branch broken under the hooves said something he would never have the courage to say. Behind him, Agnes remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the space where he had been. Her heart, as rebellious as the hair that could never be tamed, throbbed in her chest with an urgency she feared. Why didn't he give up? Why did his gaze make her believe she was more than a stained name? Why even in silence, and did she seem to hear him calling her? And why above all, did she want him to return so much? The news reached Alistair Fraser like dry wood to the fire. His eyes gleamed with perverse triumph. He was seen with her again, alone, he announced to a select group of allies. What kind of Laird surrenders to a sorceress? This whole story is revenge disguised as a fallen maiden, and he is falling like a fool. I am beginning to think he is already irredeemably compromised, incapable of thinking clearly. He moved his pieces quickly. He publicly proposed, amidst the already growing murmurs, a new council vote to discuss the management and possible redistribution of the Croix area for the sake of collective safety. The argument was a masterpiece of insinuation. A Laird who loses his senses cannot protect everyone. At night in her bed, Agnes heard the wind whistle in the tiles and the crickets sing their last song before the harder frost. Her fingers touched her own lips, not in a conscious gesture but a reflex. The memory of his embrace in the woods days ago was a low fire within her. The firmness of his arms, the way he dried her tears with a tenderness that dismantled centuries of Cameron coldness. The way he looks at me, it's as if he truly sees me. And that was the most dangerous part, because if he saw her, then she existed. And if she existed for him, how could she condemn them to the chaos that the past carried? On the other side of the village, in the cold and imposing hall of the main house, Kenneth stood by the open window, a cup of bitter whiskey forgotten in his hand. The stars looked like ice nails driven into the black velvet of the sky. He remembered the way she had looked away, as if he were the greatest threat. If I am dangerous, it is not because of her. It is because of whoever tries to touch her again. The fury he had felt in the woods was not just justice, it was possession, a primitive and clear instinct that both frightened and exalted. In the days that followed, the name Agnes MacRae circulated again, no longer in the disdainful whispers of the women at the well, but in serious conversations by the fire among men of influence. Kenneth is bewitched. She wants the pass back. She is using his weakness. Fraser fed the rumors with informal meetings, with distorted stories, with the old and powerful currency of fear and greed. Dougal entered Kenneth's room, his face serious. "Cameron, the council has called an extraordinary meeting," he said, avoiding his cousin's gaze. "For tomorrow. Fraser is following the plan with silent conspiracies." "Did you get everything I asked for, Dougal?" "Yes, everything is as you planned." "Can you tell me what murmur that snake whispers in the council's ears?" "It's about your behavior with that white-haired girl, about decision-making." Fraser's allies are louder. "They've gained support." "Kenneth, you need to distance yourself from this woman. She is harming your Watch your words, Dougal. Do not be one who repeats lies and foolish superstitions at every turn. Tomorrow, everything will be clear." Kenneth did not move. He kept looking into the darkness outside. He only closed his free hand, his knuckles white with tension beside the cold hilt of his sword. His eyes, reflecting the coldness of the stars, hardened. A raspy and definitive whisper tore through the silence of the room. "If they think they will use her unjustly to weaken me, then they have no idea whom they are dealing with." The next morning, the meeting did not take place in the council room, but in the center of the village, before the main house. It was a calculated act by Fraser to make the trial public, a ritual of humiliation that would stain both Agnes and, by association, Kenneth's authority. A crowd gathered, composed not only of councilmen, but of women, elders, and children, all the eyes and ears of the community. Fraser stood at the center, his posture inflated by the presence of his allies, and by his side, pressed into the middle of the open circle by two stern men, was Agnes. She was as pale as the snow around her, yet she kept her head held high, her eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the crowd. She wore her simple dress of green wool, and her loose silver hair seemed to catch all the day's dim light, making her appear even more ethereal and to superstitious eyes more guilty. "We are not here to judge a defenseless woman," Fraser began, his voice heavy with false reason. "We are here to protect our clan from a threat that hides beneath a mask of innocence. Agnes MacRae." He turned to her, pointing an accusing finger. "You who use knowledge of herbs for what? To heal or to poison? You who wander alone through the forests, speaking to animals as if they were human? You whose very appearance cries out to the heavens for an explanation that nature does not provide?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others avoided Agnes's gaze, ashamed but convinced. "And now," Fraser continued, his voice rising in pitch, "we see our own Laird, the man entrusted with our safety, spotted in secret conversations with you, hidden in the woods. His judgment is clouded. His decisions are questionable. Coir Fouar is at risk because the man who should defend it is distracted. Who can guarantee that you are not a spy? That you do not seek to recover for your traitorous MacRaes what they honorably lost years ago? Perhaps you are more involved than you admit. Perhaps it was you who attacked him in the pass. A cruel vengeance after years. And now that you failed to eliminate him, you are somehow drawing him into the woods with the intent to seduce him." "No, that is not true," Agnes cried in a thin thread of a voice, tears welling in her eyes. "Quiet, witch. You bewitch him with your charms to destroy him. Merely a plan to get close to him and finish the work your family started." Agnes closed her eyes for a second, a single tremor running through her body. The injustice of the words was a physical weight. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. What could she say that wouldn't be used against her? It was at that moment that the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Kenneth was arriving, and he did not walk. He advanced. His face was a mask of granite, but his intense blue eyes seethed with a glacial fury that made the air turn several degrees colder. Dougal and half a dozen of his most loyal men were behind him, and among them, his hands bound and his face soiled with terror, was a man everyone recognized. Ewan, Fraser's nephew and right-hand man. A silence fell so abruptly that one could hear the rustle of the wind in the cloaks. Kenneth did not look at Fraser. His eyes went straight to Agnes, sweeping her from the top of her head to her feet, checking if she was unharmed. The relief of seeing her standing, though cornered, was overshadowed by a wave of fury so deep that his hands formed fists at his sides. He unsheathed his sword and, looking at the men holding Agnes by the arms, spoke, "I order you to release the girl immediately. She has done nothing to be restrained or judged in this dishonorable manner in which you treat her." The men obeyed. Instantly, a murmur rippled through the small crowd divided over what they saw. "What I see here," Kenneth's voice echoed clear and sharp as a blade in the silence, "is not a council. It is a lynching, and the man leading it is a traitor and a murderer." Fraser turned pale but tried to assert himself. "Kenneth, this is an absurdity. We are only—" "Silence." Kenneth's roar made everyone flinch. He finally turned to Fraser, and the hatred in his gaze was tangible. "You think I don't know? That I didn't investigate? The ambush at Coir Fouar was not the work of bandits or rival clans, it was yours. Your man, Ewan here," he gestured with his head toward the prisoner, "led the attack, albeit in disguise. He killed the other men who accompanied me, loyal men, to make it look like an external attack, all to see me dead and weaken the Camerons, to try to take what is not yours." The revelation exploded like thunder. Cries of surprise and indignation rose from the crowd. "Lies," Fraser shouted, desperate. "Proof," Kenneth countered. He looked at Dougal, who gave a signal. One of the warriors stepped forward and threw onto the ground at Fraser's feet a silver brooch engraved with the symbol of a boar, Ewan's personal symbol and a known gift from Fraser, and his personal dagger which had been lost in the snow at the moment of the fight. "Objects found at the site of the ambush, amidst the snow and the blood of my men. Ewan has already confessed. Under interrogation, it is true, but the truth has a way of coming to light, does it not, Fraser?" Ewan's look of pure hatred and fear toward Fraser was the confirmation everyone needed. Revolt began to grow, turning against Fraser and his few allies who retreated. The small crowd murmured for justice. "Restrain yourselves," Kenneth ordered, his voice dominating the hubbub. His authority was absolute. When silence returned, heavy and laden, he continued, but now his voice changed. Fury gave way to a profound solemnity, and his eyes turned to Agnes, who watched him, paralyzed, her lips parted. "But I would not be here to bring this truth to light," he said, and now all attention followed his gaze to the pale woman at the center. If it were not for one person, this person. He took a few steps until he was only a few yards from her. The crowd held its breath. When I fell, wounded and bleeding to death in the snow of Coir Fouar, it was Agnes MacRae who found me. She who grew up hearing that my clan abandoned hers to die in the cold. She who has every reason in the world to hate me, having been relegated to a difficult life without protection because of my ancestors. She could have left me there. She would have had her justice, no one would have blamed her, but she did not do that. His voice choked slightly with a raw emotion no one had ever heard from the Wolf of Lochaber. She dragged me to a shelter. She tended to my wound with her own hands. She kept me warm, fed me, and watched over my fever for days. She saved me without ever complaining or asking for anything in return, not out of debt, not out of interest, but because her heart is good, because she is incapable of letting a living being suffer, even if it is a man like me, with the weight of pain that my name carries for her. He paused, letting the words resonate. Many in the crowd lowered their eyes, ashamed. And what was her reward? Kenneth's voice became heavy again, but this time with a painful indignation. To be called a witch, to be pointed at, insulted, feared, to be hurt. He raised his hand, pointing to his own temple, where the shallow cut on Agnes was still visible. Yes, hurt. By children and youths of this very community, while she was trying to help a trapped animal in the forest. Did you, the adults, teach them that? Did you teach them that she is not human? That she does not deserve respect or compassion? No one breathed. The silence was absolute. Agnes was trembling, her heart was racing, and her chest rose and fell in deep breaths seeking calm. But she could not look away from Kenneth, even if her vision was blurred by tears. Kenneth walked to the center beside Agnes and turned to face the crowd. His posture was that of a king, his gaze that of an angry prophet. "Her appearance," he said, his voice now a soft but unquestionable command, "is not the result of a vile pact. It is a gift, a rare beauty which is merely the external reflection of an even rarer and purer heart. A heart that, even after years of hostility and offenses, never returned malice. I ask you now, before everyone, has she ever done any harm to anyone here? Does anyone have a real story of malice to tell about Agnes MacRae?" The silence was his answer. Even the children who had repeated the insults grew quiet, intimidated by the gravity of the moment. "No," Kenneth answered for them, "because there is none. There is only silent goodness and silent resilience, and I, as Laird of these lands, am tired of foolish superstition, of cowardly cruelty, of the ignorance that wounds. From today, this ends." He looked at Agnes, and his expression softened, becoming something so intimate and protective that many looked away, as if witnessing something sacred. "She saved my life, and I, by my honor, will defend her, with my word, with my sword, with everything that I am." He turned back to the crowd, his voice final like the closing of an iron gate. "And now I ask, I do not order, I ask that those who have hurt her with words or actions at some point find the courage to ask her for forgiveness, for she is the best of us, and only now are we beginning to see." The silence that followed Kenneth's words was thick, laden with a collective shock and a shame that began to burn like cold fire on the faces of many. He did not break contact with the crowd. Instead, he turned completely to Agnes, his imposing posture now bowed in a deep, almost reverent inclination before her. "But before any word of forgiveness is spoken to you," his voice, now surprisingly soft, carried a rough emotion, "there is a request that must come first. Mine." He raised his eyes, and Agnes saw in them an old pain, a guilt that was not his, but that he carried as his own. "I ask for your forgiveness, Agnes, forgiveness for the years in which I, as Laird, allowed the poison of prejudice to poison my lands, for having remained silent, watching from afar without realizing the depth of the evil you suffered every day, in every empty look, in every cutting word. I was blind, and in my blindness, I was an accomplice." He paused, swallowing hard, The crowd was so quiet that one could hear someone's heartbeat. And I ask for forgiveness for what happened in the past, for Choir Fuar, because whatever the truth of that blizzard, 15 years ago the result was that you lost the men of your family. You were left without protection, without resources, alone beside an aunt for whom you care with such zeal, reversing the natural order of the world. That was an injustice. And I swear to you here before all my clans and before God that I will see this injustice repaired. Your honor will be restored. Your place guaranteed. The words were not just a speech, they were an oath, a solemn vow that echoed in the stones of the village and in the souls of all present. Then something extraordinary happened. An older man who had been one of those who looked away in the market bowed his head. "Forgiveness, Mistress MacRae," he murmured, his voice hoarse with shame. It was like breaking a dam. A woman who had always pulled her skirt away from Agnes at the well squeezed her eyes shut, with tears flowing. I said terrible things. Forgive this fool, Agnes." One by one, first in whispers, then, in trembling voices, requests for forgiveness began to emerge from the crowd. They were not shouts, they were not dramatic. They were humble confessions, wrenched out by the brutal truth Kenneth had exposed and by the example of humility he himself had set. Some children, confused but impressed by the gravity of the adults, simply cried. Kenneth allowed the wave of regret to flow for a moment, but then he raised his hand. There was still an account to be settled. His eyes, now cold as winter steel, met those of Fraser, who stood motionless, betrayed by his own man and by irrefutable evidence. Alistair Fraser. Kenneth's voice was the sound of sealed fate. "You conspired against your Laird. You ordered the murder of loyal men. You tried to take my life to sate your ambition. And for that you used the lies and defamation of an innocent woman as your weapon. According to the laws of the clans, with the honor you so profaned, your fate is under my authority." Fraser tried to protest, but a look from Dougal closed his throat. "But justice need not be blind like vengeance," Kenneth continued, his gaze traveling over the serious faces of the councilmen. "Dougal, gather the clan chiefs present. Fraser will be held in custody until a council of justice is formed. He will be judged by his peers according to our tradition. The evidence will be presented, and the sentence, whether it be perpetual banishment from the Highlands or being handed over to the crown for treason or a more severe fate, will be decided by the law of the clans, not by my hatred. Take him away." The solution was perfect. It was legal, traditional, and removed any accusation that Kenneth acted out of passion. It was the justice of a true Laird. Fraser, defeated and speechless, was led away by the warriors, the weight of his betrayal finally falling upon his shoulders. The crowd, still under the effect of the revelation and the catharsis of the apologies, began to slowly dissipate in small groups talking in low and reverent voices. The act of humiliation was over. The truth had won. When only his closest men and a few discreet onlookers remained at a respectful distance, Kenneth finally turned completely to Agnes, who remained by his side. The world around them seemed to vanish. He took her hands in his. They were icy, trembling. He enveloped them in his warmth. She looked up, her eyes flooded with tears that were now not of pain, but of a gratitude so deep it left her breathless. I would never have expected," she whispered, her voice choked. "I never dreamed that someone like you would raise your voice for me. Until I met you, until I knew that behind the wolf there is a man of true honor." "It was you who showed me what honor was, MacRae," he replied, his voice a heavy murmur. The Gaelic term, "my heart," hung in the air between them, intimate and powerful. "You awakened this side in me when you brought me back to life in that cabin, with your calm hands and your silence that spoke more than all the speeches in the world." He raised her hands and, without caring who might still see, bowed his head and placed a soft and prolonged kiss on the back of each one. It was a seal, a promise. When he looked up, his eyes shone with a light she had never seen. "Agnes, thainig thu a stich du mo crede. You entered my heart, and not just entered. You inhabited every closed corner, every dark and abandoned room of it. Your serene light illuminated everything. It brought a new meaning to my life. You have become the reason for my existence and the target of all my highest sentiments." He took a deep breath, as if preparing for the most important combat of his life. "I do not want only to defend you. I want to honor you, every day that remains for me. I want to love you with everything that I am, with everything that I have. There is no other woman beneath these mountains capable of winning even a single thought of mine. You already have them all." His voice failed for a moment, revealing a vulnerability that was more poignant than any demonstration of strength. "I know I do not deserve it. I know I am not worthy of someone with the purity of your soul, but I will be bold nonetheless, because a life without you by my side now would be like an eternal winter." He then knelt. There, on the beaten earth of the village square, before the eyes of some of his people, the fearsome Laird of Lochaber knelt before the daughter of the most despised clan, Agnes MacRae. His voice echoed clear and sweet, laden with a hope that made his chest ache. "Would you give me the honor, the immense, indescribable honor of becoming Agnes Cameron, of sharing my name, my home, my destiny, of allowing me to try every day to make you happy, becoming the most fortunate man, not just in the Highlands, but in all this world?" Agnes could not contain herself. A sob of pure joy broke from her lips. Tears flowed freely, washing away years of pain. She did not say a word. She simply threw herself forward, wrapping him in an embrace that was acceptance, surrender, promise. He wrapped her in his arms, burying his face in her frost hair, delicately scented. "Yes," she cried against his shoulder, her voice muffled but clear. "Yes, I accept being a Cameron, as long as I am your Cameron." He closed his eyes, a tremor running through his strong body. He kissed the top of her head, then each of her hands again as if he could not believe it. When he stood up, bringing her with him, his face was radiant with a joy so pure that it transformed his severe features. He looked at Dougal and at the council members who remained nearby, stunned. "She accepted," Kenneth announced, his voice a roar of happy triumph. "Agnes will be my wife." An old man from the council, a wrinkled man who had always been cautious, sketched a smile and shook his head, his skeptical look giving way to a glint of admiration. "Now, Laird, I am in doubt," he said, his gaze resting on Agnes. "Perhaps the young Mistress MacRae truly has magical powers. Conquering you was a feat that not even 1,000 warriors achieved." Agnes, her face still marked by tears, smiled, a true, radiant smile that illuminated the entire space. "He bewitched me first, sir," she replied, her voice melodious. In the cabin, with his silent dignity and his heart heavier than a mountain, Kenneth laughed, a rich and true sound that made all who heard it shiver. He squeezed her hand. "Now, Mograd, come. I need to speak with your aunt and ask for her blessing upon us, because our story, Agnes, it is only beginning." And hand in hand, the Wolf of Lochaber and his frost-haired maiden walked through the village, no longer under whispers of hatred, but under the reverent silence and the shy smile. The last spark from the hearth danced, painting golden shadows on the stone walls of the great room. The silence of that night, following the day's rites and celebrations, was of a new kind, not of solitude but of fulfillment. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the shared sigh of two people who had, at last, found their harbour. Agnes felt the weight of the Cameron tartan upon her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle of belonging, warm and soft. Kenneth was at her side, his gaze no longer that of the Wolf of Lochaber, but of a man whose peace had been won, not imposed. He took her hand, turning it to observe the simple silver band that now adorned her finger, alongside the marks of work that he so admired. "MOCKED," he murmured, the word a caress in the silent air. His fingers intertwined with hers, and in the touch was an entire oath. He inclined his head and touched his forehead to hers, a gesture of devotion that spoke more than any declaration. But then he pulled back just enough to see her. His eyes, now stripped of all defense, traced every line of her face as if for the first time. For so long, his voice was a husky thread of emotion. "I fought against this. I tried to call it gratitude, a debt, madness, but it is none of those things." He raised his free hand, and with a reverence that made her breath hitch, took a lock of her silver hair between his fingers. He brought it gently to his face, closing his eyes. "Your hair, so beautiful," he whispered, inhaling her clean scent of herbal soap and pure mountain air. "People spoke of frost, of the supernatural. I only see light. a light that blinds me and guides me at the same time. Your beauty, Agnes, it is so rare, so true. It leaves me inebriated. It takes all the air from my lungs." Agnes felt a warmth rise from her neck to her cheeks. She lowered her eyes, a whirlwind of emotions flooding her, shy, vulnerable, yet bathed in a wave of sweet ecstasy. "Kenneth," she tried to protest, but her voice failed her. "No," he said softly. With the tip of his fingers, he touched her chin, a touch as light as the fluttering of a wing. He lifted her face until her eyes could not avoid meeting his. "Look at me, please." She obeyed, and in his blue eyes, she no longer saw the fear of the Laird, nor the shadow of the warrior. She saw only a man totally, hopelessly captivated. "I love you." The words came out simple, direct, like a fundamental fact of the universe. "I love your silent strength. I love the kindness you don't even know you have. I love every scar on your hands, every thought that crosses those incredible eyes. I love you, Agnes, with everything that is in me, with all I have been and all I hope to be by your side." Tears, sweet and liberating, filled her eyes. She did not try to hold them back. "And I," she began, her voice trembling, "I love the man you have become for me, the man who saw beyond the shadows, the honorable man who uses his strength to protect, not to dominate. I love you, Kenneth Cameron, with all my soul." It was the confession he needed to hear. The last wall between them crumbled. With a sigh that was a contained sound of emotion, he leaned down and kissed her lips. It was a passionate kiss, the total surrender of a passion held back for so long. It was sweet and intimate, weighted with all the unspoken words, all the contained gazes, all the delayed touches. His lips moved over hers with a devout tenderness and a restrained desire that made her body tremble. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and she surrendered, her hands finding the red hair at the nape of his neck, anchoring herself in the only reality that mattered, him. When they finally pulled apart, the world around them had vanished. Only they remained, the crackling of the fire and the echo of their own hearts beating in unison. He rested his forehead against her hair, which fell in waves over her shoulders, his breathing still rapid. "Thagjeul agam ort," he murmured in the intimate space between them, repeating it in Gaelic, the language of the heart. "I love you." "Thagjeul agam ort fain," she whispered back, returning the most precious declaration. "I love you too." There, in that sanctuary of warmth, silence, and sealed promises, they knew. The hardest journey had ended, and the most beautiful one, that of living, loving, and building a home side by side, was only beginning, illuminated by the soft light of a love that had triumphed over winter. And there they sealed their union, reaffirming in silence the love that united them. The time then wove their new reality with threads of common gold. The great house of Lochaber, once a place of stern decisions and imposing solitude, filled with a different light. The scent of barley bread and dried herbs mingled with the smell of leather and fire. Mary, now with comfortable and quiet quarters next to her nieces, spent her afternoons teaching Agnes the ancient Gaelic songs, her wrinkled face softened by a peace she had not known for a long time. Her presence was a sacred link to Agnes's past, now blessed and honored under the new roof. Kenneth carried out his duties as Laird with a wisdom that seemed to have matured. Fraser, conducted by the comdale of the clans, was just and relentless. Faced with the evidence and the confession of his accomplice Ewan, Fraser was declared a traitor. The sentence was not death, but perpetual banishment from the Highlands, his lands absorbed by the Camerons to be administered with justice. To be expelled forever from the land he so coveted was a punishment considered more severe and honorable than a swift end. Ewan, for his direct role in the bloodshed, was handed over to the crown authorities, his fate sealed far from the mountains. Justice had been served, not as vengeance, but as a restoration of order and honor. A short time later, Kenneth took Agnes to Coir Fouar, not as a laird inspecting borders, nor as the warrior who had once crossed that pass amidst betrayal and blood, but as a man in debt to memory. The wind there was the same as 15 years ago, cold and biting, whispering stories that the stones never forgot. It was on that soil that the men of the MacRae family had been left to die, and it was there, ironically, that Agnes had saved the life of the man who inherited those lands. Before the small cabin that she had transformed into a shelter with her own hands, Kenneth ordered a simple memorial to be erected. Local stones, carefully arranged, engraved only with names and dates. No crests, no ostentation. A belated but sincere acknowledgement. There, he declared those lands as part of Agnes's dowry, not as a granted possession but as an honourable restitution. What had been a cause of dispute now became a bond. What had been abandonment became a promise. The cabin, preserved as it was, became known as Anti-Ete Samhach, the place of silence, a refuge where the past had found rest and where their love could always return, far from titles, judgments and shadows. At that exact point where history had nearly separated them forever, they understood. The land had not been reconquered by force but healed by love, and slowly, like snow melting to reveal the fertile earth, the mindset of the village changed. Agnes's courageous act, saving the enemy, and Kenneth's unyielding honor, defending the helpless, became a story told by the fireside. The MacRae witch faded away, and in her place emerged Lady Agnes Cameron. She did not wear her new status like a crown, but as a tool. She walked through the village in her fine wool dress in the Cameron colors, the dark green and red, that were now hers as well, stopping to talk, to listen. Her soft voice addressed the housekeepers and servants not with orders, but with respect, with a please and thank you that won hearts more effectively than any decree. She used her knowledge of herbs no longer in secret, but to help in the infirmaries, teaching the women simple preparations. The beauty that had once frightened was now admired, not as something supernatural, but as a reflection of the kindness that lived within. A year later, a sweet and unknown restlessness began to stir Agnes's spirit. It was not the icy premonition of danger, but a warm and vibrant sensation, like the first ray of sun after a harsh winter. For a few days, she observed her own body, her absent cycle, the new sensitivity. The certainty grew within her like a flower blooming in secret. One afternoon, while Kenneth was reviewing maps at his oak desk, she approached. Her steps were silent, but he always felt her arrival, as if his very being tuned into hers. She placed her hand over the map, covering the contours of lands and borders. He looked up, a smile ready on his lips. The smile froze when he saw the expression on her face, a mixture of shyness, awe, and a joy so deep it made her eyes shine like stars. "Kenneth," she whispered, her voice a thread of emotion. She took his large, scarred hand and, with a tenderness that paralyzed him, placed it gently over her still flat belly, beneath the folds of her dress. "There is a new life growing here, a seed of us both, our future." The world stopped. For an instant, he was not the Laird, the warrior, the wolf. He was just a man, before the purest miracle. His face seemed to crumble and recompose at the same time. A tremor ran through his arm. His blue eyes filled with a moist brightness she had never seen before. Without a word, he stood up, wrapped her in an embrace that was at once infinitely careful and desperately strong, as if he wanted to keep that truth within his own chest. "Mograth Mobiatha," he groaned against her hair, the Gaelic words coming out in a raspy breath. "My love, my life." The joy that exploded within him was an overwhelming force, more powerful than any victory in battle. It was the promise of tomorrow planted in the most sacred soil he knew, her heart. The years then brought the most precious sound to the stone walls of Lochaber, the laughter of children. 3 small souls filled the corridors with life. The firstborn, Archibald, 7 years old, was the image of his father in childhood, a mop of unruly red hair, serious blue eyes, and a proud posture that promised the future Laird. The middle child, Coinich, 5, had the same fire-colored hair, but his mother's easier, more carefree smile. And the youngest, Mary Elizabeth, 2 years old, was the miracle that melted everyone's heart. Her hair was a soft cloud of frost-like strands, as light as her mother's, but her eyes were her father's deep blue, and Kenneth confessed that the combination was his greatest weakness. On a cold night, the family gathered around the great hearth of the main hall. Kenneth was in the wide armchair, little Mary dozing in his lap, a tiny hand clutching his finger. Archibald and Coinich were sitting on a deerskin at Agnes's feet, as she told an old Gaelic story about honourable warriors and mountain spirits. Their children had been taught, from their first breath, to honour and protect their mother and sister. Kindness was not weakness, and strength was not brutality. These were two lessons that Kenneth and Agnes lived every day. "Father," Archibald said, his serious eyes reflecting the flames, "when will my training with the sword begin? And riding like a warrior?" Kenneth exchanged a fond look with Agnes before answering, "Next week, Momac. You are ready to learn that a warrior's true strength comes from here." He pointed to his own heart, "and it protects what is most precious. And me, Father." Koinik jumped, his eyes shining. "Can I learn to ride too? I want to protect Mother and Mary." "You too, my brave one." Kenneth smiled, his heart full of a silent gratitude. "In this way we will care for the two treasures we have at home together." The boys smiled triumphantly and ran into Agnes's embrace, and she held them, kissing one red head and then the other. "My brave warriors," she whispered, her voice full of love. Kenneth approached, carefully placing his sleeping daughter in the nearby cradle. Then he turned to Agnes. He placed his hands on her face, his thumbs caressing her cheeks. "Look at what we have built, Mo Krieger," he murmured, his voice a thread of emotion. "Look at this beauty. And it all began with you, with your silent choice in the snow, with the courage of your pure heart." He kissed her then, a slow and sweet kiss, which was a thank you, a promise, a celebration of all the tomorrows they would still share. And so, in the warm light of the home they had built, the story of the poor girl from the scorned clan found its perfect end, or rather, its perpetual beginning. She discovered that true honor is not born of power, but of the choice to be good. That dignity is not given by a surname, but earned through integrity. And that forgiveness, when sown in courageous soil, flourishes into the most enduring and radiant happiness. In the arms of the Laird she saved, Agnes MacRae, now Agnes Cameron, did not just find love. She found her place in the world, and in doing so, redefined the very meaning of home for everyone around her. Every story born in the Highlands needs someone to keep it alive in their heart. For this reason, leave a like and the hype on the video, subscribe and turn on notifications to continue this journey with me. And if this transformative love between Kenneth and Agnes moved you, leave a comment and help this legend echo further. Other stories are on the way. I'll see you in the next video here on the channel.